Hello, everybody. My name is Jim, and this is a spoiler-free review of Mrs. Bridge by Evan S. Connell. I read this book last year, and I wanted to review it to maybe motivate or encourage me to read Mr. Bridge, which is the companion novel for this. I've been holding off. I enjoyed Mrs. Bridge so much that I have a feeling I won't enjoy Mr. Bridge as much. Because naturally he shows up in this novel too, and his personality just, it's not bad, but it's not exciting. It doesn't seem interesting to me. However, he does have a relationship with Ruth, which is one of his and Mrs. Bridge's children. You didn't really get a lot of Ruth in Mrs. Bridge, and I'll explain why in a minute. But Mr. Bridge seemed to be closer to her, and it would be good to kind of understand that dynamic a little bit more. So hopefully with this review, it jumpstarts my desire to complete the companion series and read Mr. Bridge. It's a little bit longer than Mrs. Bridge, but I really enjoyed this book, and I do want to review it. So I'll just get into it. This is about an upper middle class white woman in the 1930s, which is probably an immediate turnoff for a lot of people. But you also have to understand that the 1930s was a different time. 10 years prior to that, in the 1920s, I think it was 1920. I have to check again, and I'll put the correct date in the video. But that was when women were given the right to vote. And you have to think that even the upper middle class white women still didn't have a lot of that power and that control that their male counterparts had. This story, as it is historical fiction, it takes place in the 1930s and then kind of goes through World War II. It spans a number of years. This explores that, and it's an important read if this is something that you want to know more about, but I do understand that this book is not for everybody. It is written as a series of vignettes. I found that a lot more digestible. It was nice. It was nice to have those small glimpses into her life that ultimately gave me a better understanding of her trials and her tribulations despite being in that upper middle class suburban white household. One of the first things I do want to point out is that Mrs. Bridge is a bit of a bigot. It wasn't blatant, but microaggressions do exist, and she did present them quite often during the book. It was something that I didn't feel was intentional on her part. I know that when she said these things, she didn't think that she was being racist and homophobic, but she certainly was. And that's something that was ingrained that she had trouble detaching herself from. It was written as a bad thing. And as a book that was written in 1959, the insight that Evan S. Connell wrote was, a little bit ahead of its time. People would shrug these sorts of things off. They wouldn't count them as microaggressions. He did a good job of making her realistic without making it seem like what she was doing was okay. Mrs. Bridge seemed to reach for control whenever she could find it. Her life was so empty, and her children played a big role. Ruth wanted nothing to do with her. Ruth was the oldest child, and she had a better relationship with Mr. Bridge. So Mrs. Bridge really just had Carolyn, the middle child, and Douglas, the youngest. Carolyn looked up to Mrs. Bridge. There were so many things that Carolyn wanted to emulate because Mrs. Bridge on the surface was so put together that, Carolyn wanted to be put together too. Douglas was a rambunctious little boy. He would experiment with things. He would build things in the backyard that were dangerous. He would get muddy and dirty. He would say things that he probably shouldn't to the guests at the house. And he was probably Mrs. Bridge's best distraction. She needed one. And there were some times in the book where even though she was scolding Douglas for the things that he had done, she appreciated that he was there because she needed some sort of authority with someone in her house. But as this spans over a number of years, the children grow up. And it's something that is interesting to follow. And I'm not going to say much more about that. It's just something that when you read this book, make those connections with what Evan S. Connell is trying to present It very much is a story about a woman who has everything but nothing. Her husband lavishes her with gifts, and she lives in a beautiful house. She has a housekeeper to handle all the chores. She very much seems like she has it all, but when you're given everything, there is an emptiness. There is dissatisfaction in your life when you don't have the autonomy to get these things for yourself. And that is the overarching plot of this book. She just needs something to call her own. It's an important book to read despite being rich and white. We like to talk about the privileges that some people have and the privileges that some people don't. And I do think at the end of the day, while we are observing privileges and we are checking people and checking ourselves, that we do look into some of these other situations where you think that they have it all and understand a little bit more that maybe they don't, you know? Not anything substantive, anyway. And I think that that's where this book shines. And again, it's written in 1959, so it's a bit ahead of its time. I guess it's considered a classic. The only thing is that I don't really see or hear very many people talk about it. Again, Mrs. Bridge, even though I saw some reviews giving this a low rating saying that the concept is outdated, it's not. There are still people like Mrs. Bridge around right now. And I wish that certain people would read Mrs. Bridge so that they could look inside themselves a little bit. But if you don't need someone to relate to, I still think it would be a good idea to read this book. It's a short one. The vignettes are easy to get through. So if you would like to, the link to Mrs. Bridge's Goodreads page is in the description below. Click on that, check out the retailer of your choice and purchase it from there. Or you can borrow it from your local library face-to-face or using your library app. Otherwise, I've been Jim. You've been great. Happy reading.